Hello and good evening, everybody. I'm Schindhelm, the initiator of a series of lectures on global culture. We have started in spring this year and are about to continue tonight with Carlo Ratti, who I'm very happy to see among us and welcome in particular. Thank you, Carlo, for being here tonight. Carlo is a trained architect from Italy, who has his architectural practice in Torino, where he was also taught. He was also taught in Paris and holds even a PhD in philosophy, despite his professional profile today. He obtained in Cambridge. Apart from his architectural practice in Italy, he is also running a laboratory for research at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the US, and this is the major reason why he's here today among us. Carlo is an inventor in some ways. He is also a publisher, a writer. He is a researcher and an advisor in various international contexts and organizations, among them also the World Economic Forum. And Carlo is also named several times by Central International Media one of the most creative young designers of our time. In particular, for his digital water pavilion in Shanghai at the Expo 2008, he received very, very strong response. Carlo and I, we got to know in Moscow a couple of years ago. In the meantime, Rem Koolhaas, the architect, and I, and a few other colleagues, we started in 2010 to establish a platform for research and education for architecture, design, and media, named Straka Institute. The institution still exists. And in the second year, Carlo came on board with his team and took over one of our research departments. So the Straka Institute is a platform for international experts and students from Russia and other countries to study and to research urgent topics of Russia today in the fields of architecture, design, and media. So Carlo came on board in 2011, becoming one of the directors, and it turned out that we share a strong interest in the status and the development of urban conditions, in particular in a great and at the same time very complicated city like Moscow. But whereas I came from the angle of urban culture and tried to study the life in public spaces and how much this mirrors the transition, the social and political transition in Russia today, Carlo was rather coming from a very different angle, using mobile technologies and his knowledge he gained during the last years together with his colleagues in the US on that subject for sketching in a real time the status and the development of urban conditions. So tonight he's here to give us a speech. And I just want to remind you that already in my first lecture I tried to say that global, to me at least, doesn't mean necessarily only earth-spanning, but at the same time also border-crossing. And you, Carlo, at least in my eyes, represent actually both sides and both facets of what global is supposed to be. On one hand, you're traveling a lot, you're just coming from South America and have to go back tomorrow to the other part of America. And you have your practice in many cities across the globe. On the other hand, you use modern technology for studying urban conditions under very different social circumstances. And I do think that your effort in terms of social analysis as well as design shows that contemporary technology also supports what we call cultural globalization. I think that's why it's good to have you here tonight and to hear what you have to say on the real-time city. Thank you very much. It's your floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Michael. And it's a great pleasure. Oops. It's a great pleasure to be here with you tonight. So I think what we'll do tonight is I'll present just some of the work we've been doing at MIT at the Senseable City Lab. When we were discussing this with Michael about the selection of projects, we tried to put together a few things that actually tried to connect the level of the individual and data at the individual level and how this scales up to the global, to the city level and to the global level. So these are some of the projects I want to share with you tonight. And then, I want more I will be quite agnostic while presenting the project, just putting them on the table, and then we'll have a bit of discussion together and with all of you about, what this means and how this is changing, can change our understanding of the city, of how, we can collect information from the city, we can design the city, and ultimately live the city in a different way. So maybe we could turn down a little bit the lights. But I wanted to start with this picture. There's something that people used to be very fascinated in the 1990s about a world that would become increasingly virtual. And so much so that in 1995, somebody like Gilder, an American writer, said, we're headed for the death of cities. Cities are leftover baggage from the industrial era. Now, bear in mind, this is 1995, at the same time that people like Nicolas Negroponte, in the same year, he published Being Digital. Bill Mitchell published a book called City of Bits. Cairncross, more or less, wrote a book called The Death of Distance. So people were so excited about this new digital condition of connectivity, they thought that physical space wouldn't matter anymore. Now, no prediction could have been more wrong, as we now know. We know the cities have been thriving over the past few years. That's a picture from China. China itself is planning to build more cities than all of humanity ever built. We also know that cities, since 2008, host over 50% of the world population, and according to the United Nations, that number can swell to almost 5 billion. So we believe that what has happened is that the digital condition has not killed physical space, like Gilder and other people at the time used to think, but actually digital and physical are kind of recombining and creating a new hybrid dimension. It's a dimension between bits and atoms with us in the middle. And let me make an example. This type of thing, this kind of that engineers would call cyber-physical system, is something that has been emerging in many other disciplines and in many other fields. One field, for instance, is Formula One. In Formula One, 10, 15 years ago, to win a race, you needed the physical infrastructure, you need a good car and a good driver. And today, if you want to win a race, you actually need also not only a good car and a good driver, but also a system like this, made of thousands and thousands of sensors that collect information from the race, send it to those computers, where it's analyzed, its process, and decisions are made in real time. In other terms, it's what an engineer would call a real-time control system, which is a system made of two components, a sensing component and an actuating component. Sensing about collecting information from those that gets to those computers, and then actuating, just responding to that information. And sensing and actuating is really what every dynamic system does, but also what every living system does. When we see each other tonight, we sense each other, we collect information from each other, visual and other type of stimuli, and then we respond to that. So sensing and actuating. And again, with the same picture, what seems to happen is that our cities are being transformed a little bit like into that Formula One racing car. The amount of information we can collect from our cities is staggering, and that will really be the focus of what we will look at tonight, how much information we can collect from them and how much information we can collect in real time. And then, that's a sensing component that then allows us to do new types of actuation or responding to that information. And I made that just one example. If you look at this curve shows you the growth of cell phone communication over the planet. Now, it might be surprising today to think that little over 30 years ago, we didn't have cell phones. We could actually live without cell phones. The first one is, the first commercial network is 1979. It's in Japan by NTT. And then it took a long time to get to 1 billion. And here's 2 billion and so on. It has been growing since then almost exponentially. Now, you might say, you know, there's 7 billion people on the planet. How much more can we grow? Well, according to Ericsson, who so far, they never missed the prediction in this space, they think we're just here, and we will go there by 2020. Now, how could it be? Well, it's not that each of us will carry like 10 cell phones in our pockets, but it's something else. It's the fact that we started by connecting people to people, and then we moved into people to data, and people to machine to data, as you find in most cars, and more is what people call M2M, which is machine to machine. In other terms, it's almost as if every atom out there in the physical world were becoming both a sensor and an actuator. Now, all of this is also producing an incredible amount of information. This is what some people, or people since a few years, have started calling big data. That's the definition by Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google. You know, more than a definition, is actually just a fact. The fact that today, if we take all the information produced by humanity from the beginning till 2003, well, that's more or less the same amount of information we produce over the past couple of days. And it gives you a sense of how much data we're producing. Now, if you take all the data that was produced by humanity from the beginning till 2003, over there you had Goethe, you had beautiful literature, you had many other things. We haven't produced all of that over the past 2 days, but the quantity, the sheer quantity, is actually the same. Another definition of big data is the one that a friend of mine, Mike Batty in London from UCL, University College, you know, gave recently, which is big data is all what you cannot put in an Excel spreadsheet. But there's something quite profound about that. We define that actually big data is something we need to manage and cope with in a different way. We cannot use the standard tools we're familiar with. We actually need to develop new tools to cope with it. So what I wanted to do tonight, and actually, as I said, I would like to keep the discussion later. Now I will be very agnostic and sterile in presenting this, but I want to put on the table a number of projects that deal with different types of data we can collect from cities, with data that bridge the individual dimension with the urban dimension, the city dimension, or the global dimension. And you know, just then we can have a discussion about them. Just the last 3 slides, I will actually try to suggest some possible interpretation, but at the moment I would just, you know, do kind of more, put on the table a number of projects. Now, I divided these kind of projects into 3 chapters. One is opportunistic big data, so big data that we can collect because people call it opportunistic because it is data that's collected for another reason and we can use it for something else. And then user-generated, which is all what we produce every day when we you know, use Twitter or Facebook or you name it, any other type of media. So that's data that we produce. What some people call it's not about Big Brother, it's about little sisters, you know, everybody tweeting and showing and sharing information. And then it's also data that we purposely sense by using sensors and other type of devices and can allow us to understand something about the world outside us. The first thing I want to share with you is something that we did at Venice Biennale in 2006. This was one of the first projects we did with our lab. We had just started. And we had a small pavilion there where we decided to try to map a city in real time using data from the cell phone network. This is what you see. And we then got this huge amount of information. It was the first time that this was done, collecting data from millions of people, anonymized, aggregating, visualize it in real time to understand what is going on in the city. I'll share with you, 2006 was an interesting year. That summer it was actually the Soccer World Cup, some of you might recall. And actually, Italy and France were in the final, and Italy actually won the Soccer World Cup. So look at what happens, for instance, in the city of Rome, in the Italian capital, during the final of the Soccer World Cup, when actually Italy won. Some of you might recall Italy and France, at the last minute, there was a headbutt by Zidane, and then because of that, he got a red flag, and then after that, you know, Italy won. But here is what happened. By looking at the data from million of people in the city of Rome, there you see the day of the final, before the match, as you see to the right. You know, and people are moving here and there in the city of Rome, you know, going and buying stuff. It's a normal day. And it's the early afternoon, then the match begins, silence. Nobody talks anymore. France scores, Italy scores. Halftime, people make a quick call and go to the bathroom. And then end of normal time, then the first overtime, the second one, Zidane got the red card, and Italy wins. Now, that night, you know, then everybody goes to celebrate in the city center. You see a big peak here. The following day, again, actually people go to meet the winning team. They came back from Germany. And you see if there's a big peak, and then the prime minister and the winning team were there. And by the end of the day, actually it was a big party at a place where since Roman times, people go and celebrate, called Circo Massimo, since Latin times. And that's, you know, they see the big peak at the end of the day. Well, you know, the same thing then that was 2006. The same year, we also looked at some similar data. In this case, you see is Amsterdam. It was actually the following year. What you see here is actually text messages just before the end of the year, the 31st of December, when everybody say Happy New Year, which is what you saw there. And then you see got the beginning of the new year, and so on. This text message on the thing. So this is all data at the individual level that actually tell you something about the city when you aggregate it in an anonymous and aggregated way when you put it together. Now, of course, you can look at this and also jump all the way to the global scale. And that's what we did the following year at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, by using data from AT&T and looking actually how New York connects with all the planet. We call it New York Talk Exchange. So what you see here, well, here you see all the connections, but then you can zoom into this. And here you see, for instance, London, how it connects with, you know, this beginning of the day, and, you know, the day starts in Europe, and, you know, London starts talking to New York. You go to South America, some of the key capitals, you see Sao Paulo, Rio, Buenos Aires. Then you got Asia actually going to sleep here. You see the end of the day, but still a lot of activity. So, I mean, how this can also tell us something about global communication. In this, we actually work a bit with Saskia Sassen. As you know, Saskia, she's been working a lot on the idea of global cities. And how, well, Africa, by the way, very sad. You saw only one spot in Africa. It was only two spots, Joburg and Cape Town, but everything else, like, you know, these are the top 200 cities, and you see nothing there in Africa. So how this can tell us something about local connections and global connections, starting from the individual level all the way to the global level. And of course, you know, you get all this data, you can visualize it. Within visualizing is quite important, because once upon a time it was easy to do a map, but now you got so much data that you need to find a way to put your hands in it and start seeing what is going on. And so new type of visualizations become the first step in order then to analyze it. And so after you got the first ideas, then you can look at the numbers and try to better understand what's going on, like comparing different times of the day, you know, doing different using the data, visualizing in different ways in order to understand what's going on. Again, here you see New York and the amount of information in different directions. You can also zoom into it in more detail. So what you see here, for instance, is looking at almost like the DNA of the city of New York. You see the different boroughs. You see Manhattan, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Queens, and the Bronx. And what you see is there to see how different parts of the city connect in different ways to the world, which is actually part of that is related to the immigrant community and the people there. So here is just, you know, one example, but you can zoom into every pixel and look at kind of this DNA that tells you what are the top destinations for internationally for each of those pixels. So you can again explore the local dimension and zoom into the kind of very, very small, fine-grained detail, and at the same time look at the global dimension and in how this actually tells you something about how New York as a global city connects with all the other cities. And as I said, you know, this is after the visualization and some initial analysis that you want to get to more and more sophisticated analysis. So there's actually interesting mathematics you can develop on some of this data and the interesting findings. You know, I'm from MIT, so I had to add a slide like this, but I will skip it. And if you get this, but in this example, for instance, then you can answer interesting questions. The similar data collected for the UK in this case. And with this data, we actually asked the following question, which is a very important question for the government. It has been a very important question for the government over the past few years. The governments have been trying to redraw constituencies and actually better understand boundaries in the country. So we said, well, imagine then you can build this very interesting network of human interaction, how we all communicate with each other. Then the question is, can you use this information to better understand geography, to redraw, in this case, the map of Great Britain based on all this information? And you know, what you find, you see it in a moment, is that actually you find Great Britain, which is not exactly what we know. Some of it is very close to what we know, like Scotland, but actually other parts like Wales are quite different. And that's, you know, a geography that doesn't come from history, doesn't come from politics, but it only comes and emerges in a natural way from the way we all connect with each other. That's the idea. So every time you got telecommunications, you build links between places. And then if you aggregate all of this for the whole country, you get something you could call the human network. What is the intensity of connections between all of us? And then what if you could use that actually as a way to better understand communities over space? How tightly knit are communities over space? And what you see is what I was saying before, that actually some regions are quite similar to the existing ones, the one we know, but actually some others are quite different. And they reflect this kind of more natural geography of human interaction. So, well, and this was in the UK. We then did the same analysis with the data you saw before in the US. You see it here with, you know, again, you can kind of, you see something interesting that actually some of the boundaries, again, are very stable. Because some of the boundaries actually, like think about Europe, think about this country. Some of the boundaries are actually mountains or are lakes or are rivers. So actually some of the boundaries are natural boundaries that, you know, are there because people naturally wouldn't cross. And there would be little communication between one side of the river, one side of the mountain, and the other side. But actually, other boundaries are the ones that are changing, and are changing as our cities evolve, as our countries evolve. Well, these were just some examples of what you can do with data from telecommunication networks. This is kind of what I call opportunistic data, data that you can collect, that is collected for other reasons, and you can use for understanding something about the city, the individual, and the global scale. There's many other types of opportunistic data we collect today. Almost everything you do, you know, today when I was coming here, the planes I boarded and every transaction I did is probably going into database and, you know, is part of this data that is collected for other reasons but can tell us something about what is going on. Credit card data is one example. What you see here is Spain, and this is credit card data, again, anonymized and aggregated just before Christmas. You see people, you know, buying different type of things, groceries or hypermarkets, bars and restaurants, and that's, you know, the 23rd of December. You see the standard peaks at night, then people go more to bars and restaurants. Then, you know, they got the last day before Christmas. That's when everybody thinks, remembers all the things they forgot to buy, or the presents they forgot to buy, and you see a big peak in a moment. And then you got Christmas Day, which is actually very, very quiet. That's when you know, everybody then is celebrating with their family. So you can get it. But again, from this data then, which is just visualized, you can do different type of analysis. For instance, what you see here, you see kind of small businesses, how they attract clients around from the neighborhood. So where are clients coming from a small business? And there's a big difference. If you look at something like food, you don't want to travel too much. So actually, that's a distance. So this curve goes down very quickly because, you know, you want to go and buy food quite close to yourself. But actually, for fashion, you might be ready to travel much more. So you look at the difference between the previous curve and this curve. And then the same you can apply to many other type of businesses. It tells you a way of how the city works as a sum of all these different activities. Activities are all linked with each other. And that's the network of how people go from one place to another place, from one activity, from one shop to another shop, and how all of them are kind of connected and tell us something about the structure of the city. Well, I wanted to finish this section about opportunistic data or data that, you know, is collected for other reasons with something that we've been doing on our campus at MIT. Now, what you see here is MIT. You see Boston, downtown. You see MIT is almost like a little city inside the larger metropolitan area. You see the River Charles here, Harvard, don't bother, up there. And you know, MIT was one of the first universities to be fully covered with Wi-Fi. That was really in the early 2000s. And because of that, we've seen incredible changes. Before, people used to work like you see to the left, and now they tend to work like you see to the right. Now, this picture is a bit extreme. I looked for the worst possible computer room I could find. You saw no daylight and, terrible. And then if you look to the right, it's not always like that. When it's winter, it's minus 30 Celsius, 20 Celsius, and so on. It's not like that, but it gives you a sense of a big change that's happening. So we said, what if we could actually use the same net data from the network? Again, this data that people collect in order to run the network, in order to understand what's going on. So the network is producing these changes, but the network can also be the way for us to understand what type of changes are going on. And what you see here is actually all the hotspots, which are the places that distribute the Wi-Fi, and then you can see how Wi-Fi activity changes during the day, which is what you see here, how people move from one part of campus to the other one, and so how activity changes from the dorms to the classrooms, to the labs, to the restaurants, and so on. Now, then for each of the spaces, you can actually get a kind of a curve like this that tells you the signature of the space. Let me show you, for instance, the aggregated curve of all of MIT, which is what you see to the top. So you see Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So you see people get to MIT quite early, around 9 o'clock. You get some people get stop working around 5. But actually, a lot of people keep on working quite late, till quite late at night, till 9, 10, or even later. Still in the middle of the night, there's a lot of activity, which is what you see here. And the same pattern actually repeats itself on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, not Friday. You see how different the peak is on Friday. But also Saturday and Sunday are almost like 2 normal days. If you remove the 9 to 5 people, the few people who are 9 to 5, there's actually quite a lot of activity on Saturday and Sunday, with something that's always there. And then on Sunday night, you always have that peak. And that peak, the little peak, is actually every Sunday night between 9 and 10 p.m. And that's when everybody remembers, shit, tomorrow is Monday again. And then actually they remember all the things they have to finish and go back to work and do some work to prepare for the next week. Well, if you do like this and analyze all this information in different ways by using Fourier analysis and other, what you find is something quite interesting. You find is that actually the way this place is working is in a very different way than what people and planners and architects thought. People who plan MIT still thought like Corbusier. When Corbusier wrote the Charte d'Athènes, he actually said that everything should be divided. It was in the 1930s, everything should be 31. Everything should be divided. We need to have a place for living, a place for working, a place for leisure, and then connections in between. But if you do that, you create a crazy city where you have different parts of town, and then they are empty most of the time, and there's no communication between them. So since the 1950s and 60s and 70s, people in planning have been talking about mixed-use development. Jane Jacobs was one of the key advocates for this, but many, many others. But what seems to happen today is actually a new kind of blurring between the different spaces, almost like a blurring between private and public, creating a new type of transition and creating a new structure of the space of the campus itself. So this, just as a way of how the data can tell us something when it's simply visualized, and then when it's analyzed, we can understand better what is going on in this case on the MIT campus. Now, sorry. Now, I'm being very, we'll have all the discussion later about this, about what is good and what is bad about all this data. The second type I want to share with you is something user-generated, is what we all generate just by going online every day. A lot of that is about social network. Many examples. One example, a project we did a few years ago, we were among the first group to look at data from Flickr. Flickr is, images, pictures being taken. Like in this room 10 years ago, you probably would have like a camera, or just, one camera, or you count the cameras on your hand. And today there's probably 200 cameras. Every phone has 2, every computer has 1 or more. So the amount of digital pictures we've been taking has been growing exponentially, and a lot of these pictures go online on places like Flickr. So we said, what if we can use this information that we all upload, and this is all information that's been made public to everybody, in order to understand what's going on in our cities. Again, it's individual information, but it tells us something, when aggregated, about what's going on in a place. So what you see here, for instance, is Tuscany. And you see how people take pictures in Tuscany. You see the hotspots for this. And then you can zoom in and look at downtown Florence, and then you can look at the most popular photograph places. And then you can zoom in all the way to one building, like the Duomo here, and look at actually where the places where people take most pictures. Now, that is only the intensity of pictures being taken, but if you do something slightly more sophisticated, you do a little script, and you go and read on every picture the time it was taken. If you do that, then you can create a network that tells you how pictures are taken at different times and how people have been moving over Tuscany. So I got a question for you. So here you can see Italians and Americans as they move in Tuscany and take pictures. Now, where are the Americans? To the left or to the right? You need to make a decision. So Americans to the left, raise your hands. Americans to the left, okay. Americans to the right. Okay, more or less 50-50. Well, in this case, you see Americans are to the left. And they are to the left, so the first group was right. And they're to the left, if you live in the United States, you go to Tuscany, you might be going there once in a lifetime or once every 10 or 20 years. And then you go to the main places. You see almost this kind of elephant's path of people going through the main cities, through Genoa, Pisa, Florence, Siena, Perugia. Well, if you're Italian, you've been there many times, maybe you're even from Tuscany, you actually go and try to explore space in a very different way. Look at the small little villages. Look at this island, called Island of Elba, where there's apparently no Americans, or at least no Americans taking pictures on Flickr, but actually a lot of Italians going there. And and if you look at this data, you can tell you many other things. What you see here is something that our students started looking at. What you see here is Barcelona, and where is the best way to go partying in Barcelona? By looking at the pictures, looking at what people do and what type of pictures people upload. Some of the researchers even managed to get a paper published looking at the geographies of Britons and parties in Barcelona. They turn out to be incredibly similar to each other. And then you can also look at other things, like you can look at the pictures and look at the color of the picture, and then you get almost like a natural way to understand what is going on in terms of drought. Drought is a big problem in Spain during the summer. The country gets drier and drier. And if you look at that, you look at how the color changes, how the country gets less and less water, then you got almost like a free way to monitor drought. Now, we call the project the world's eyes, in Spanish, los ojos del mundo, as a way to say, how can we really use all of our collective information that we collect as a way to understand what is going on. In this case, to look through the eyes of all of us about what is going on in the country. Now, the last category I want to share with you is how we can actually then use sensors in order to see what's going on, again, in our cities. And the first project is the project where we looked at this computer. Now, if you take this computer, you know everything about it. You see it on the map, every chip from this computer, you know where it was produced, how it moved on the planet, how it became this machine. But then a few years from now, when you throw away this computer, you know very little about it. Sometimes this is what happens to it. A lot of e-waste from Europe goes to Africa. A lot of e-waste from the United States goes to Asia, some of that illegally. And so our question was, what if you could actually develop a little tag to put on trash, a little sensor, a little tag, to put on trash and follow trash and see where it goes? Well, we couldn't find anything off the shelf, so we had to design this little tag. And we worked with Qualcomm, a big chip manufacturer in the United States, to engineer this. Then we did a first deployment. This was the first deployment we did in the city of Seattle. So 500 people and 3,000 pieces of trash. And then after tagging all of that, we started following it. So you got 3,000 objects, the day of deployment in Seattle. After a few days, a lot of that is going to some of the main landfills next to Seattle. But then a big surprise, actually, how far stuff started to travel. Sometimes in a crazy way. Look at the trace that went all the way from Seattle to Chicago, and then down to Baja California. So moving without reason, with no reason, for thousands and thousands of kilometers. And still moving after 1 month or 2 months. We thought the Fireworks Symphony was the music. Well, you know, you can tag and follow trash. The same thing is happening with many other type of sensors. This, for instance, is Lisbon. Is a beautiful visualization of Lisbon done by Pedro Cruz, who was in our group and now is living in Portugal. Lisbon, by looking at data, billions of points taken from taxis. People have put a little tags on taxis, GPS tags, in order to get a position on taxi, and that's the data that you get in order to understand what's going on. And with this data, you can do interesting things. What you see here is the same type of data in New York City. That's the airport in New York, and what you see is in yellow and in blue, you see pickups and drop-offs of taxis. And then you can ask yourself, what if you could design a better system in New York where you could actually see who else is going next to where you're going and share a taxi? So, you know, is there any way, there's so many taxis, could you design a system like that? You know, very simple idea, like this. If you ask yourself this question, and let's put another constraint. So let's say that you want everybody to get to their destination with no more than a 1 or 2 minute delay based on what they would have had normally. Let's say we use different thresholds, but between 1 and 3 minutes. So basically you get to your destination at the same time, but you got the ability to share a taxi. Well, if you do that and you analyze the network of taxis in New York, what you find is that you could actually, you see it in this picture, you could actually almost cut the number of taxis by 40 to 50% and give exactly the same service to citizens. So that tells you how this information in real time, if shared with all of us, can tell us about how we can run, in this case, mobility infrastructure in a different way in the city. And that is part of a much broader trend. You know, I'm sure you're familiar with Airbnb, with a lot of Airbnb as a way to kind of create it's a very successful system that has created kind of a distributed hotel whereby people can share part of their home with other people. And you know, and this increasing willingness that we have to share, which is enabled by the ability and the availability to get real-time data in the city. Now, this showed you how much data we can collect from the city, but also the car itself can actually collect a lot of data. And in this project, for instance, in the next project, what we've been doing is work with Volkswagen to use sensors inside the car and see how they can tell us, for instance, how frustrated the driver is.
We just finished the drive. It was incredibly stressful. It was the most stressful drive I've ever been on. Nevertheless, I think we have a lot of great content to measure road frustration because I'm certainly frustrated at this point.
So you see all the sensors here inside the car.
And Jesus. God. Okay. Stop the car.
So we were just sideswiped. And right now my stress level should be through the roof. We got the information, you know, we'll have to process the data and see where it's really at.
So we have a lot of data from the city itself. We have a lot of data from the car itself. And out of the intersection between these two types of data, one of the biggest changes in mobility is going to happen very soon. And it is actually what people call self-driving or autonomous vehicles, which is vehicles that drive themselves on their own. You might have heard about Google has developed one, MIT has one, other universities are working on it, and also automotive companies. And when you got that, then everything changes in terms of mobility. Everything changes because you blur the difference between private and public mobility. The car can take you to work in the morning and then can give a lift to somebody else, to somebody in your family, or really somebody else, so it becomes almost like public mobility. Or you can imagine a system where you don't need traffic lights anymore, where actually the flows of cars at the crossing will magically intersect without bumping into each other. Don't try to do it today yet, but that's what can happen. And that becomes interesting because, again, you know, it becomes probably the only hope we have in order to solve the traffic problems in some of the big cities today. You know, when Michael and I were in London, in Moscow, when you go to the airport in Moscow, you don't know if it will take you 30 minutes or 3 hours based on the traffic conditions. In China, a few years ago, there was the longest ever traffic jam, which actually was a week. People go stuck in traffic for a week in a traffic jam. And you know, the only way we can solve that is not really by building more highways or adding asphalt, but is if we actually add more silicon, more intelligence to the system, and this is certainly one way to add more intelligence. And all this data, you know, in the end, allows us to navigate the space and the city in a different way. This is a project we just did. The next one is a project we just did a couple of weeks ago at MIT. We actually started, it was the beginning of the semester, and you know, there's a big problem. MIT is very difficult to navigate. It's a place where every room has a number. Those numbers are very complex. You know, people coming to campus for the first time at the beginning of the semester, they often are lost, especially if they come from Harvard. So we did this project that in order to try to help them.
Welcome to MIT. Where would you like to go? Follow me, please.
Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab is the largest research lab at MIT.
To your right, the Media Lab. To your left, the Data Center.
Follow me, please. Approaching your destination.
You have arrived. Welcome to Senseable City Lab.
Goodbye.
Well, we looked at different type of data, and you know, I just put them on the table. Now we'll have the discussion in a moment, but we look at what I call opportunistic, so you get it, it's collected by some other people, credit card companies, cell phone companies, whatever, and you try to use it in order to understand something about ourselves, about our cities, about our communities, about the relationship between the individual and the global. Then user-generated, which is all this data we produce ourselves, then purposely sensed. There's a fourth category, perhaps, we could add there, that's, you could call it serendipitous. And I'll give you just one example of that. It actually happened when a burglar came to our lab at MIT. And remember the project, the trash track, where we had the little tags that actually allows us to follow trash and see where it goes. where the burglar stole a lot of things from our lab at MIT in Boston, including some of the tags that tell you where they go. And this is what happened. And I wanted to conclude and lead into the discussion that we'll start now, is this was really presented in a quite agnostic way, but this is some of the data that is being collected as we speak. So this is something that's happening. What you're seeing here is just ways to use this data that exist in order to tell something about our cities. But we think that this is creating a very different condition with the relationship between us and our built environment. If you look at this, that's Nolli's map of Rome in the 18th century, which is, one of the pillars of modern cartography. That was the type of environment we thought we could describe. But actually, the environment we're immersing today is something that looks a bit more like some of the things we've seen before. It's something that's real-time, that's dynamic, and actually bridges all these scales between the local, the individual, what happens at the level of the atom, and what happens at the global level, and how all of those levels are interconnected with themselves. And, this is something that's happening. We are just, here you just saw some visualizations of it, but it's having, we believe, very profound implications that we need all to look at, and look at in a critical way, which is what I hope will happen now in some of the discussion. In a critical way, because this is actually questioning very important things about the relationship between us and how we represent the space around ourselves. That's actually from Lewis Carroll. Borges had a little story that was based on the same principle. And that's, and then came the grandest idea of all. We actually made a map of the country on the scale of a mile to the mile. Have you used it much? I inquire. It has never been spread out yet, said Manhur. The farmers objected. They said it would cover the whole country and shut out the sunlight. So now we use the country itself as its own map, and I assure you it does nearly as well. The idea that when we collect everything from our space, then the map and the space become the same thing. And you cannot tell the difference between one thing and the other. You got this total copy of actually what we have in physical space. But then there's another very interesting short story that actually Italo Calvino, the Italian writer, wrote in 1969. It's called The Memory of the World. And actually, it was much earlier than all the digitization processes we've seen over the past 20 years. And in that little story, actually, Calvino starts in a very Piedmontese way with somebody who found a system to put all the British Museum into a chestnut, to condense and save all the British Museum into a chestnut. And then the idea that then because of that, there would be the idea to save and record everything that humanity has ever produced. Well, if any of you is interested in the short story, you should read it, but I will just tell you that short story, in a certain sense, is what's happening today, is about recording everything about what's happening in our cities, what's happening on our planet. But that short story that took that as a starting point and looked at the consequences of that ended up without escape with intrigue and drama and ultimately murder. And I think, that has something quite interesting to tell us about the condition that we are building today. And I wanted to finish with this, and I think that could be to finish this and to pass now, Michael, with to the discussion. Thank you.
It was a great and comprehensive talk. I think we have something like maybe 25, 30 minutes or so for getting maybe a little bit to the terms. You already said that you made a rather, you called it agnostic presentation. You could also maybe say affirmative in the sense that you're rather putting the things that you say on the table in order to be discussed further. And this is what we are probably trying to do here. Maybe I start, and later also we try to open up to the audience, because I think that you will have also one or the other question. We are living indeed in a technology-driven society today, and this was a great, tremendous experience to follow your experience, your work, your professional work during the last years, showing how much technology aims at understanding in real time the condition we are living in. However, we are at the same time in a society which is very much concerned about global issues. And for me, it's one of the things I would like to a little bit go on here together with you, how much your effort is linked to that. On one hand, I can see that you collect a lot of data. So there's really a tremendous possibility in understanding our current situation much better than we did before. But for what purpose? Who is actually processing these data, and what we are going to do with this information? I think that hubcaps are certainly a great idea, but I think we have extremely urgent global issues to tackle, like, let's say, climate change, or let's say world population, hunger, water shortage, resources shortage. How much do you think that understanding, using technologies of that kind can help also understand better how to deal with urgent global issues today?
Well, I would say that there's one first urgent global issue that I think we should all be aware of, which is about the data. What we've seen, when I say agnostic, is that we've shown you some visualization of data and some possible uses of data, but we think that the most important thing is actually just to be aware of the data. I think what we've seen with the Snowden affair just recently, a few months ago, is really about some of the great problems we have today, is that a lot of this data is not accessible to everybody. There's a kind of asymmetry in the access of data. You got states or big corporations who actually know a lot about you, and you know very little. It's more and more opaque, the relationship we have with them. So we think that, just the very fact of visualizing some of this data, when we did it the first time for Rome, in real time using data from the cell phone network, for us was just as a way to put it on the table and start having a discussion about it. And we think that that's very important, because this is creating a very different condition. So you shouldn't see it as affirmative in the sense that we want to go there, but we want to, yes, to be affirmative in the sense of saying this is what is happening, and we need to be aware of it. And the reason we need to be aware of it is that this is changing radically many assumptions about how we relate with our past. We're creating a world of total recall where everything is saved and everything then can be recalled. And there's something that was never like this. We are creating a place where it's going to be impossible to forget. And so then there's that is radically changing very important things about really the way we live, and we live with each other, and we share information. And I think we need to understand how that is happening, to understand the process, and also to understand how this will shape our society tomorrow. So the decisions we will make together about that, about how to manage this information, is what will shape the way our society will be tomorrow.
I mean, you speak already about the ownership of information. Of course, the main question popping up just listening to you is who is actually collecting the data? Who is this? Who is Senseable City? Or on whom's behalf you're doing this? We saw that you often work for multinational companies who have, of course, already most of the data anyway about us. And the question is, as you say, how much visualization of data is really something helping to change the ownership of data, what I think is actually indeed one of the most urgent issues in information technology today. Yeah,
well, it's a great point. So it's not that we are collecting data ourselves, especially for what the first category, you know, the first one, the largest one, what we call the opportunistic data, is that it's been collected by others, by companies. That's collected regardless of, you know, what all we are discussing tonight or what university and research does. But it's data that we think it is important to use and to make public and to show, because that is something that's going on today. And then, you know, if you ask yourself who's collecting this, well, it happens in every system. It happens probably here with the IDs of the university. It happens at the airport when you do a boarding pass. It is just a consequence. It's quite interesting because it is one of the unexpected consequences of this huge process of digitization. If you go back to the 90s and read some of the literature of the 90s about, you know, digitization and being digital by Nicolas Negroponte and many of the other books, they actually got a lot of things right about what they was going to bring with it. But most of them missed this component, which is that once everything becomes digital, you got this incredible amount of data that you save about our physical world, and this data can be searched, and, you know, can be archived and searched, and you know, radically changes our relationship with what is around ourselves. So as I was saying, you know, this is not in all the cases. I mean, it changes from case to case, but for instance, in all the first category, which is data that's collected usually by big companies, we think it is very important to actually do two things. First of all, just to visualize it and make it public so that people know about this, and then also to try to see, well, you know, given that it has been collected, is there any positive use that could be done out of it?
I imagine that you would work not for multinationals, but maybe for consumers, which is actually the other side of the game. What many people today think is that most of the information is owned by companies and is actually our data, and there should be actually ways on how to get this information back to the people who have produced the data, who actually have a right of owning them also. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think you know, it is it is a very important question. Now, certainly I think that the way things are today with data, with a lot of asymmetry and actually not equal access rights to some of this data, is not the way to go. Having said that, there's probably two ways, and you know, there's different people arguing for different things. You know, some people say exactly what you're saying. You know, one way to say is say, well, everybody should have full control on their data and decide with whom they want to share it, how they want to share it, when they want to share it, and so on. Now, this is interesting, and it's easy to say. Now, unfortunately, as you know, when something is leaked, then you don't have control on it anymore. So if something, actually, you cannot put it back inside the bottle if it leaks out. The other option that some people have also been thinking about is, you know, could you actually think about a society of total transparency, where all the data is public and it is accessible to everybody? Well, even that would be better than a society where access to data is non-symmetrical, which is more like a Mandarin society where actually data is used as power by certain groups against other groups. And now, it is interesting, you know, people who argue for this condition, they also go back to a long time ago, you know, over 7,000 years ago, when all of us here in these mountains would be hunter and gatherers. Well, at that time, apparently, so the scholars tell us, privacy did not exist. And in hunter-gatherer society, privacy, you know, was very, very limited, almost did not exist, and things were shared. Really, even the most intimate things were shared inside a group. And, you know, could that be also an option? It's interesting. You know, that could be an option if we manage to avoid discrimination. What we've seen is that the opening of data has also been reducing discrimination. but probably would require a new kind of contract, almost like, not a social contract, a kind of data contract that can actually help understand how we cope with this new situation. Now, anyway, a lot of things could be said about that. We could think about different methods. These are two examples. I don't know which one is the best one, but one thing I know that the society we will create tomorrow will depend on all the decisions we will make today about how to use this information.
My last question for now, then I open it up to you. One thing is collecting data, another one is interpreting data. You here and there made some hints on how you interpret data, but I think there's much more to say than you have presented. Of course, you had only 45 minutes, but can you give us an example where you think that there is a much more powerful dimension in interpreting the data you have collected on cities, on users of whatsoever tool, because that is probably what makes it particularly intriguing to thinking about how this can actually provide further understanding of how to really use real-time data also for actually today.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question and a broad question. I will just mention a couple of things. The first one is that the interesting thing about real-time data is that then it promotes a change of behavior. And so it can promote a change of behavior. It can promote this kind of loop we were saying at the beginning of sensing and actuating, responding to the data. Let me make an example. Just, you saw the project about collecting data about trash and how trash moves. One of the most interesting things was that we shared all this data with actually people involved in the project. So you actually, all the volunteers came with all their trash. We put a tag on the trash, and then we allowed them to follow their own trash. And one of the most interesting things was one person told us after the project, said, I used to drink water in plastic bottles like this one every day. And, throw them away and then don't think anymore about it, forget about them. And after the project, now I know that they go a few miles from home, they go to a landfill, they will stay there forever, so I cannot forget about them anymore. I stopped drinking water in plastic bottles. So an example of the fact that this increased information, especially real-time information, can promote the change of behavior. There's a quick consequence of that. The other example that people do all the time is about traffic. So you know that there's a traffic jam somewhere on the road, and then you will take another route. This is something that was much more difficult 5 or 10 years ago. Now it's becoming quite common, thanks also to some of the real-time information we have through Google and so on. So the first thing is about how real-time data can really help us to start this kind of sensing and actuating loops. The other thing about the analysis is that probably this is going to change a lot our social sciences. If you think about the social sciences, in the past, they've been constrained a lot about the lack of data and the need sometimes to get data through questionnaires or through experiments, but it was very limited amount of data. And what becomes interesting today is that, there's a few people arguing that social sciences are becoming more similar to the hard sciences in the way that all of this information can help us better understand many mechanisms about how we come together, how we live in cities. People argue for the creation of a new science of city that would not have been possible if all this information were not there. So these are just two couple of examples of how the data, and you were saying the interpretation of the data can have impact if it is real-time data or if it is data that we archive, and then we can use it to better understand how we live together.
Further questions from your side?
Or comments? Yeah, I see there's a... I know.
There's somebody leaving. It's hopefully not a comment. She's leaving. No. Okay, so then maybe I ask another question. So when what otherwise interests me is somebody. We are sitting here in an art school, right? So most of the people dealing here with not so much with big numbers and not so much with precise sciences, but rather with individualistic approaches to all sorts of issues. You said that you try to combine the smallest and the largest somehow in your presentation several times. What is very obvious that you deal with big numbers and with sort of global dimensions in many ways. Where is really the individual in your equation?
Well, all of the data actually you saw there starts at a very fine grain. You know, if you think about the trash, it starts with individual object thrown by somebody. So you got all, you know, all the volunteers who came and with different pieces of trash, and then each of those pieces is tracked individually. But then when you aggregate it at the level of the city or at the global level, then you get something else about the other dynamics. If you look at the telecommunication, all of that is anonymized data, but again, it starts with something very close to the individual. Sometimes it's aggregated by zip code or by, you know, the little neighborhood, but it starts with something very close to the individual, and then you can add it up and look at the other scales in the middle. So from the individual to the neighborhood to the city to the global level. So that's what you can do with this data. That again is something quite new. That given the granularity. That theoretically is, you know, this is not happening yet, but if you take all the information I left, all the traces I left sometimes today while I was coming here, you know, on the plane or when I use my credit card in the taxi or when I enter here and so on, all these digital traces, if somebody were able to combine them, you could really reconstruct almost every moment of my life. And more with what some people do called quantified self, which is, you know, you can measure yourself and a lot of things about your body, like, you know, the steps you're doing and so on. There's either bracelet that people, they're getting very popular, that people wear that actually that actually tell you a lot of things about your heart rate and the steps you're taking, and, you know, if you're sleeping well or not. So all this information is the information that describes the individual, and then can aggregate to all the other levels, all the way to the global scale. And again, you know, this is what is happening today. I think it's very important that we're all aware of it, and it's very important that we participate in the discussion. Now, from our point of view, we organized a couple of years ago a conference at MIT called Engaging Data, where we had privacy advocates, the Obama administration, academics and big companies all discussing this topic. And if any of you is interested or happens to be in the United States on the 15th of November, we're going to do another Engaging Data conference where we'll have Noam Chomsky, is an academic and scholar and activist, discussing this with Barton Gellman, who's the journalist and Pulitzer Prize winner who leaked Ed Snowden in the Washington Post, and perhaps also Ed Snowden connected from Russia by a thing, because we think that this is really something very important we should all discuss. So I think, you know, that's the way the way I structured the presentation tonight was more to put the things on the table to say, you know, well, this is something we should be aware that can have very interesting and positive applications, but also we should really think about how data is being collected, how data is made accessible, and how it should be used.
You said already that to some extent information collection is a matter of power. And if you just look at more recent political movements almost everywhere in the world, in Western countries, but in particular, as we know, in the Middle East, or also, let's say, in some countries in Asia and in Africa, you see that social media and mobile technology plays actually an instrumental role in gathering people and making them stand up. On the other hand, phenomena like, for example, information leaks have also created enormous shifts in power. So disruption of information systems are sometimes equally powerful than connecting people. My question is, do you actually imagine that your technology, or let's say your sensible, your interpretation of a sensibility of a city through technology would help also to, on one hand, maybe anticipate, and on the other hand, maybe to also support improvements or enhancement in social communication and public communication of that kind?
Well, yeah, actually, thanks for mentioning this. One of the key things that we haven't discussed tonight is what we all saw over the past few years with the Arab Spring and many other movements that actually would not have been possible without this, in Russia as well, in Brazil earlier this year. So all these movements would not have been possible without this kind of real-time new data sets. The ability of people to tweet and to share information in real time. Real time becomes very important because that's how actually during the Arab Spring people could respond faster than the government to the changing conditions locally in Tahrir Square or you name it. And so then that becomes, you know, again, another example of the positive use of some of this data, especially when it's very fresh in real time and when it's used by people in a kind of bottom-up way. So that's transparent data, is not held by somebody else, but it's made available to people, and people can use it to better organize. And in the same way, I think that a lot of this information, again, you know, what I'm saying is that there's a positive and the negative, and here I didn't present it before, but you know, if you want to look at the positives, you're hinting here, there's a lot of this analysis can really help us to understand much better, you know, what is going on in our cities or in our society, and create many different type of feedback loops. The real-time feedback loops, which is, as we said, the Arab Spring, but also much slower feedback loops. You know, if you go back to Élisée Reclus, who was one of the people who over 100 years ago was writing about planning and so on, his idea was, you know, planning is made of this cycle of surveying, collecting information, and then planning, a bit of sensing and actuating. And what we are doing here, we're just having an incredible new way to survey, to understand what's going on around ourselves, and then to plan, to imagine a possible new, different or better future.
There was a question here from the public. Yes, there's a microphone.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not an expert on anything, and it's you've been talking about, and it's very fascinating to follow this, and it's a fast-opening world. And you've been very much talking about the potential of this big data approach, and this made me ask about what are the limits, actually, of this kind of big data approach. And coming back to Michael Schindhelm's question about the real big issues of global life these days, for example, poverty, isn't it actually that some of these issues are hardly dealt with at a digital level? For example, poverty, isn't it the case, or hunger, that actually there is very little digital data available capturing this, which could be visualized, because you know, digital is more or less the digital life. There's a kind of digital divide, or there was this discussion about the digital divide, that large proportions of the global population are actually excluded from the digital world. So might this be a limit, or what other limits to your approach could you talk about?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, I would say certainly one of the limits is what we were saying before, is about the access to the data. There's certainly one of the limits we've been discussing tonight. About poverty, actually, I wouldn't use that example, because I think this can actually give us a lot of help against poverty in two different ways. Well, the first way is actually there's a group called the Poverty Lab. They're doing very exciting research, and what they're doing is actually using data. Again, I don't know, you can call it big data or not, but actually using data on a large scale, which is actually data inspired by the methods used in medicine in, you know, this kind of blind trials, in order to actually understand what are the most successful strategies to take people out of poverty. And actually that tells you that actually this data as well, and the ability we have to collect this data on a large scale today, may actually give us an insight on one of the important questions about, you know, how can we actually solve some of these issues that was much more difficult to answer before, given that there's so many interlinked and interrelated variables. I'm not an expert in that field, but if anybody's interested, you know, the Poverty Lab, I think, is one of the most exciting things happening these days in this space. The other thing, you know, which is not about how this can help us better understand the dynamics of poverty, but actually itself, digital technology can help change the condition itself, is something we've seen more and more in recent times. Now, I want to mention first another limitation, which is something one has to be very aware, which is the kind of accessibility to the technology itself, the kind of divide. When the digital came, people were very concerned about the digital divide, and, you know, still today it is an issue. With mobile phones, it's been a bit faster in the sense that today you got places where people don't have, you know, running water, but they actually have mobile phones or smartphones. But still, you know, who has access to which technology is always something we need to be very careful and look in detail and, you know, and pay attention to. Now, however, what is quite encouraging is that in some places, this allowed people to leapfrog, to start from a condition where they were behind and actually jump ahead of others because of, you know, stepping intermediate steps. And one example, you know, is that mobile payments are more developed in some African countries than they are in Europe. Just because lacking another type of infrastructure, people started using the cell phone for doing things that they couldn't do otherwise. So this is the ability of some of these technologies and some of these data collection actually to help people leapfrog and go one step ahead of the ones who were ahead before. By going back, so in this sense, what I would say to summarize is that, you know, there's both the power of data to better help us understand poverty and also the power of data and digital technology to lift people out of poverty in some cases by this kind of leapfrogging that we see more and more in more contexts. At the same time, in terms of limitation, we always need to be very, very careful about the access, both the access to the data and the access to the technology, the kind of the different divides. Is the data divide, is the digital divide, is the mobile divide that we might create?
One last question, please.
Lots of your researches deal with the movements of people in cities, or from one city to the other one, and so on, from trash, from cars, from taxis, and so on. One of the most dramatic issue of our times is the movement of millions and millions of migrants and of refugees. Lots of them have smartphones or digital phones, mobile phones, but our cities, and I'm speaking from European cities, most of them, as the politics of the European Union are fighting the migrants back, and they have no interest to see them in their cities. Saskia Sassen said that migrants have an enormous power of production, of fantasy, and cities should be grateful to have them, to have their ideas, and to have them in their boroughs and so on. Look at Switzerland. Miss Samaruga from the Bundesrat is proud to have, I think, 150 of those refugees from Syria. Couldn't it be interesting to find out the real-time movements of migrants and refugees in the world of today? Couldn't that be an issue that could be powerful?
Yeah, it's a great idea. For a great project. It is something that actually it's something we wanted to do. It's something that the United Nations are actually started to looking at. There is a group at the United Nations called Global Pulse, and they managed to get data from countries, especially where there's big migrations for one reason or another, in order to use that information from cell phones in order to better understand what's going on. So I think it is something that would be a great project. Some of it is happening, but you know, it's something probably where there's still a lot to learn. And I think, however, the most crucial question is then what happens next. You know, after you visualize those those flows of human people across countries or coming into Europe and so on, then the big question is what you're saying is, you know, which stance you take and how, you know, how you can find policies in order to find a good outcome for them and for the country. So what I mean is that then that becomes fuel for the discussion afterwards, which is the most interesting discussion. And I side with Saskia Sassen, but I think I would guess that, you know, that is where most of the discussion needs to happen, with the data that you can finally collect in a very precise way that you couldn't collect before. So yes, it could be a great project.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlo. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here tonight. I think you really opened not only to the people who were talking, to many of us probably, a new window to a subject which is quite instrumental, quite important for the understanding of our current life in our cities, in our society, also in a more global context. I do think that it would be exciting to see what you're doing in 1 or 2 years from now on this subject, how much you manage to push the boundaries further and to get more, even more and even closer to important urban urgent issues in our cities of today. I think that we are particularly in Western countries today, extremely torn between being obsessed with technology and at the same time very skeptical about it, how much it can really fix our life and the life of our children. I think that you produce something quite transparent and quite comprehensive in making it better understood. And in particular, I want to make you a compliment also for the way how you present academically quite important and aspiring content in a way which is cheerful and very understandable. I hope to see you back at some point and wish you all the best for your next projects. And this brings me back to the question, what is actually your next project?
I'll tell you in a moment. First of all, let me say, I don't know if technology is going to save it or to take it to a better life, but I think we all need to be aware of it in order not to allow technology screw up our life. And I think that was a little bit to take away from tonight's discussion is about, these are some of the things that are happening out there as we speak, and that we should all be aware of, because the way we cope with that is what we will shape our society tomorrow. And about our next project, we are starting to work on some exciting projects in cities with people in the Department of Biological Engineering, and actually looking, in the same way as each of us has a biome. The biome is all the billions and billions of bugs that live in our bodies and that live with us, kind of our companions for our lives, and that is different from person to person, where we're looking at how we can actually characterize this kind of microcosm in cities, and actually how that might also be related to different conditions in cities and so on. So we're quite excited. That's one of the things we're working on at the moment. And again, there you have another world of data that's opening up, which is the world of DNA and data that's related to genetic data and sequencing. That's another world, but that's probably for the next discussion, and I look forward to being back.
Okay, so maybe the human body is the next sensible city. Thank you very much. Last question, very last question. So, was the computer actually found at Harvard, or?
No, the computer actually, as you saw, it was found. Some of you might see, those of you who know Boston, you saw that the computer crossed the bridge, so went on the Boston side. Harvard and MIT are on the Cambridge side. And then, this poor guy who stole the computer actually then, as you saw, had it beyond other things, we had the GPS data and so on, but also had a T-shirt with their business address. So, it was quite easy for us to find it. However, because this was quite unusual what happened. So the students who found all the pictures went to the police. And it took them a little while to explain to the police what had happened, because they went to the police and said, "Hey, so they stole my computer," and say, "They stole our computer," and they say, "Okay, sure," and then say, "And we know where it is, and we got a picture of it." And the police will say, "Wait a minute, how do you know? How do you take pictures of it? I mean, did you steal the computer or something?" So the whole thing became also interesting that it took them a little bit to understand how the whole system was working, and that's another interesting component about how the data can then be used, and how sometimes it breaks some of our thinking. In that case, for the policeman, about how you can. It was inconceivable for the policeman he was talking to that he could know where the computer was, and he could take pictures of it without actually being involved somehow in the stealing.
I mean, we are actually on top of a museum. And that just brings me back to what you were saying earlier, that it turns out that objects, once you make them speak, have to tell you a lot of interesting stories. This is what an exhibition and the museums are about. Maybe there's a later stage where a collaboration between you and curators would be actually very interesting.
Yeah, but I'd love to.
We probably cannot elaborate on this now, because I think you have to get to the airport, and we probably have to wrap it up now. Thank you very much, Carlo, once again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.